There is that wonderful old parable that Buddy Sheridan tells about a man wandering through the wilderness, making his way on foot, and he reaches an impasse, a river which he cannot cross. It is far too wide and deep, the current too strong to risk swimming across it. So he walks up and down stretches of the river, trying to find a natural land bridge. But there isn't one. So he finally reaches a stretch of the river which opens up and he can see to the other side, and he notices a person on the other side of the river, and he waves his hands to get this person's attention. And then he hollers out, "How do I get to the other side of the river?" And the man hollers back, "You are on the other side of the river." That our point of view matters. That what we see is not always what everybody else sees. When Jesus went to the region of Tyre, he entered a house and he did not want to be noticed. We're not sure if it is because he was tired, preoccupied, or weighed down by a particular burden, but there was a woman who was a Gentile from the Syro-Phoenician region who did notice him. And we don't know if Jesus was burdened, but we do know that she was. Her daughter was not well. So she asks Jesus for help, and at first, he dismisses her. He says, I have to first tend to the needs of the children of Israel. And admittedly, it's a hard conversation for us to overhear. It sounds dismissive, even demeaning. But she persisted. Even the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs. And Jesus, seeing her faith and seeing from her point of view, said, "Your daughter has been made well." It can feel awkward to us talking about whether Jesus learned from the perspective of others, like this Gentile woman, as if it takes something away from him as the Son of God. But the grand mystery of the incarnation and its gift to us is that we take such comfort in knowing that Jesus knows what it is like to experience this life the way that we do. From the human point of view, that as the Word became flesh, Jesus learned about the pains of hunger, the difficulty of suffering, the temptation in the wilderness, or the sadness of loss from our perspective. And this story is strangely similar to the one where Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus went to a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and everyone was in a panic because the wine had run out. And Mary looked at her son and said, "Jesus, you need to help." And Jesus looked at his mother and said, "It's not my time." And as she left the conversation, she simply told the servants, "Just do what my son tells you to do." And Jesus turned water into wine, that it turned out to be his time. That perhaps this Gentile woman ushers Jesus into a new time of expanding his mission to Gentiles. That Jesus, looking through her eyes, saw something important. We know that the book of James focuses on the tongue, that what we say really matters. But James also focuses on the eyes, that what we see also matters. James says if we see someone come into this room wearing gold rings, that we should not see them any different than the person wearing dirty clothes. Do not show favoritism. James goes on to say, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? That we are invited to look through the eyes of others. I still remember when my eyes were opened in discovering the challenges tangled with getting an ID. That we all look forward to getting our driver's license, to holding that piece of plastic in our hand with that terrible picture on it. But in order to get an ID, you have to have the proper documents and an address. But there are countless programs assisting those who are poor and homeless where an ID is required. Without an ID, you can't fill out the forms or qualify for the benefits. But if you are homeless, you don't have an address. That James invites us to look through the eyes of others, which is where faith leads us to works. Because when you look through the eyes of others, you cannot help but see ways to be helpful. I read a compelling and heart-wrenching story about Suzanne and Alan Robertson and Cecil Johnson. Suzanne is an attorney, and she and her husband Alan were invited to attend a meeting at a Baptist church in Nashville about prison ministry. And it turned out to be a church associated with the CBF. And at that meeting, Alan decided to respond to the invitation to start visiting an inmate on death row, to try to be the presence of Christ for others. Cecil Johnson was an inmate at Riverbend Maximum Security in Nashville. And at first, Suzanne was uncomfortable going to the jail with Alan. But slowly, over a few years, all of that changed. They got to know Cecil. They learned about his childhood, which was horrific. It was every child's nightmare. Somehow he survived, and then as a young man trying to make it on his own, he made certain mistakes. But then he found himself convicted of a crime that he said he did not commit. A federal court even determined that there was evidence withheld in his initial court proceedings but it did not overturn the verdict. What became central, though, to Suzanne and Alan was their deep love and affection for Cecil. He became part of their family. In fact, the title of Suzanne's book is He Called Me Sister. She says that Cecil taught them what it means to show up, what it means to be the presence of Christ, what it means to forge community across differences. And Cecil was executed December 2nd, 2009, a day that they still grieve. It is a story about seeing through the eyes of others and seeing more of this world and more of God. After 15 years of visiting Cecil, Suzanne writes, "We started out with the uncomplicated belief that a person's humanity should be valued, and that person, guilty or innocent, incarcerated or not, deserves compassion. It is an uncomplicated belief. Every person is a child of God. But life has this way of making what is uncomplicated very complicated. And the only way to love others and contend with all of those complications is to look through the eyes of others." After 15 years, I still miss seeing Don London. Don is the facilities manager and volunteer coordinator at Stewpot in Jackson, Mississippi. Stewpot's a ministry that provides meals for the homeless, offers a clothing closet, shelters. And the first Saturday of every month, I would meet the youth at the church at 8 a.m., and we would cook lunch for Stewpot. Menu was always the same. It was about 120 chicken sandwiches with mustard, 2 large pots of corn, and then 2 large pots of their favorite fruit cocktail, and a bunch of boxes of oatmeal cream pies. And when we finished cooking lunch, we loaded up the cars and we drove over to Stewpot to serve the meal. And the person who always greeted us was Don. Before we got out of our cars, he was opening the door, coming out to greet us. He must have been perched up there looking down out of the window, waiting for us. And I never saw Don in a bad mood. He always greeted you with this big old bear hug. He wanted you to feel welcome and like you belong. And to hear him sing in chapel, he was always full of joy. And Don was excellent at his job. He would walk around the room and tend to the needs of everyone at the meal. That Don was good at his job because he had seen through their eyes. Don was not only an employee of Stewpot, he had also benefited from their programs. Don had been through addiction, and he knew what it can do to your life. He once said, I was being prepared for this ministry by the defects of my life. And I still miss seeing Don because he made me see differently. That we are called to look through other people's eyes, returning again and again to that uncomplicated belief that we are to love our neighbor in a complicated world. That we can open our eyes and see more of this world around us. We can open our eyes and see more of our neighbor in front of us. We can open our eyes and witness more of the steadfast love of God. Amen.